Today, I'll show you how to build a fully customizable garage storage system that is beginner friendly, costs a little over $300, and only takes 1 day to build. Let's face it, you have a problem. Okay, I have the same problem too. I have too much stuff in my garage, and the storage options that I have available, they're all terrible. They're terrible because, well, they're either too expensive or they only fit a perfectly blank wall. I can't make the storage unit look good and go around something like my refrigerator or my tankless hot water heater that I have. Or I can build something that's cheap, but ultimately just it looks terrible, like this little DIY hack job that I did about 2 years ago. So there's got to be a better way. There 100% is. So check it out. For this storage unit, my base is going to be 10 feet long, a little over 8 feet tall, and then the width of the base is going to be dictated by that overhead attic stair at 24 inches. Now, I'll show later how I'm going to install this over my refrigerator, but first, let's talk about the base and securing it to the floor. A lot of storage systems require you to screw directly into the studs, which I can't do here because there's a concrete beam. So the way I overcame this was just to get larger lumber. I'm using 2x8s here, so 4 pieces that are 4 feet long, 2 pieces that are 2 feet long, and then 8 pieces that are 21 inches long. Those 21-inch pieces will be the pieces that are actually in between, which you'll see here in a minute. I did use a countersink bit just to pre-screw all of my holes, and then I used construction grade screws, 3 inches, to be able to hold those bases all together. Do you have to use a countersink bit? I mean, no. Is it overdoing it? Maybe. But a countersink bit is really helpful because it allows you to have those screws held in place for you so you're not having to fumble with the screw and the drill and the lumber as you're trying to mount everything together. Again, a countersink bit is very cheap. So I think the one I have is $30 on Amazon. It might be 50, but either way, you don't have to use this. It just helps to avoid splitting wood. So you're going to see me using the countersink bit throughout the project. And again, it makes it where it becomes a little bit more just assembly line. You're able to do piece by piece a little bit more quickly. So I made 3 individual bases. Now these bases, once I put them on the floor, there is a 4-foot section, a 2-foot section there in the middle, and then another 4-foot section. I just use clamps to hold it all together and use some additional 3-inch screws to send 2 screws in on the different corners of those bases and just hold everything together. Now, one thing I will point out here is the concrete. The concrete looks sort of straight. I mean, it's rough. And then the 2x8, it looks straight. But when you slide it up against the wall itself was not put on the concrete perfectly straight. So the wall on one side is 1.5 inches off of the base. And then on the closest side, it's 1 inch off the base. I'll get to how I address that here in just a minute. But before I do, I'll talk about separating the base from the floor. This isn't treated lumber. Treated lumber is a little bit more expensive. If it is treated lumber, you can just place it directly on the slab. Instead of doing that, I use these little composite shims and just leveled everything out before I screwed it in place. I did start at the closest side, that little 1-inch gap side, and used a 6-inch lag bolt to secure this to the wall. You don't have to use a lag bolt. You could just use a 5-inch decking screw if you wanted to, but I chose to do this. As I put in these lag bolts, you can see the base is actually rising up a little bit. And whenever it brought up the base a little bit off the shims, I had to re-shim it to make sure that it was level on the back and on the front of the base. Next, I went ahead and pulled out my track saw. Don't judge me. Okay, so I don't have a track saw. I just used a piece of MDF because MDF is already straight. It's milled to be straight. And a circular saw with some clamps and cut down this 2-foot by 8-foot section, slid it into place, and then cut another little 2-foot by 2-foot section. Now, to mount all of this onto the framing that I had, I used 2.5-inch construction screws, and I'm using this little frame as just a mock-up to show you what I did. I would use a speed square, pre-mark all of my hole locations, countersink it, and then drive those 2.5-inch screws into place. Then I went ahead and cut down 2 additional pieces to mount those plywood sections onto the ceiling. Now, word to the wise, ouch. Okay. I would be sure that if you can, try to get a partner to help you install this. It's much easier with 2 people. It is doable just by yourself, but it makes for a very awkward install. You got to hold it there with one hand and then push with all your might, and you just end up making the world's weirdest faces trying to make sure you don't get that thing dropped on your head. So for these bins, remember I had to turn them to the side because of that attic stair overhead. The ones on the right are turned differently because they have more additional space. Now I'm thinking I'm going to put a little workstation here so I can mount some drill batteries, put some different little storage boxes that I need for my tools and sandpaper, and then probably just stack 2 rows of shelves right in a row. I'm not exactly sure what I'm going to do for this third spot here, but we're going to find out. When it comes to assembling the walls for this storage unit, you're only going to see me assemble one wall, but I follow the same exact process on every single wall, and you can too. This is modular, and so it's going to make it a lot easier for you to install. I cut down a whole bunch of 1/2 inch wide plywood strips and then used a spare 2x4 to mark the edge so that I knew exactly where I needed to send my screws into. I didn't want to randomly choose an area and then send a screw through the front face of my wall. Then I took 2 extra strips and put them onto the base and then measured from the strips to the ceiling, both on the front and the back of the base. Now, the base itself is level. I've already leveled it out, but this is going to account for the difference in height for the ceiling. And the ceiling itself, depending on where it was, did have a little bit of a differentiation between the front and the back piece. So, word to the wise, just label each individual 2x4 that you cut front and back so that you don't get confused. That'll save you a lot of time. With the wall completely assembled, I then slid it into place and used my hammer to make little adjustments, making sure everything was snug and tight against the base and against the ceiling before using an impact driver, just sending several 2.5 inch screws through the base itself and then also into that plywood on the ceiling. I then grabbed a lid from one of my storage boxes and used it as a spacer to determine exactly how far apart my next wall would be. After marking that on the wall, I just double checked that measurement with my tape measure and then put up the wall, double checking it again with my tape measure, making sure everything was exactly where it needed to be before screwing it all in place. To install that first box, you can just set it directly on the plywood. Why not? It's already there. But to figure out the exact spacing between the bottom box resting on the plywood and the top box, I use these extra strips of plywood to just act as spacers. From the bottom of the box to that bottom black rail is just about 14 inches. So I'm going to be able to use that 14-inch measurement later just to pre-cut 2 14-inch sections, which you'll see me do, and use them as preset spacers. But for this first box, I used the level and marked right underneath that little black part of the box where the rail will need to go so that I can slide the box smoothly in and out of the storage walls. Those guide rails are going to be made out of 2x4s. So I cut several sections down that were 2 feet long. And then what I'm showing you here is I'm using some setup blocks to cut down the 2x4 straight down the middle. A 2x4 is 3.5 inches wide, so I took several setup blocks to total 1 3/4 inches. And then I set up my fence for the table saw to allow myself to cut several 1 3/4 inch strips of these 2x4s. Again, this just allows me to maximize the material I have instead of using a thick 2x4 multiple times, which in the end will make the build a lot more expensive. After that, I took all of my strips and used a 2x4 edge to just mark exactly again where I would need my screws to go to pre-mark everything with a countersink bit. Again, you can't overdo it when it comes to countersinking. Okay, I guess you could overdo it, but it is extremely helpful. Even though I countersink almost every screw on this, there still were a few pieces that I had cracked just from overdriving them. So I would definitely recommend that you choose to do so as well. It was then at this time I had one of my lovely assistants come out and inform me of the benefits of protein in cheese sticks. There was also some other substance that started with an A that's inside of cheese that's beneficial, kind of like protein. I have no idea what she was talking about, but I was very informed. So who knew you would get nutrition content on a DIY channel? But apparently now you do. So you're welcome. Next, I just went about setting up 3-inch spacer blocks for the additional top rail there for the storage shelf that I was going to have directly above that first bin. Now remember, I'm sliding in a piece of plywood here because this is going to be a sort of workbench area where I can, install different tools or have extra sandpaper or plug in drill batteries or things like that. But I noticed that this far right edge was actually just warped a little bit. That framing that I had used, that stud, was warped slightly. So I used a clamp just to overcorrect that warp before screwing everything in place. And then I mounted some additional rails for an extra shelf above that one. Okay, so this is an alternate way you can install these walls and shelves. Instead of standing the wall up, then using a level and screwing every single rail in place, you can actually just start from the bottom up, lay out your wall on the ground, use these 14-inch spacers or whatever spacer length works for you based on your exact boxes. Then you can stand up the wall, double check that everything is level using a level, and move on from there. I actually found that way was kind of superior, a little bit faster, and honestly just more enjoyable. Then it was time to move on to storage over the refrigerator. Now the setup for this is really simple. All I'm doing is kind of what I've done before for the rest of the build, but I'm using a 2x4 base, and I'm either securing the 2x4 to the wall or I'm securing the 2x4 base to the framing of that left wall that I had established right on the left side of the refrigerator. So I started with the back piece. I screwed it into the wall using 3-inch screws and then used additional 3-inch screws to screw that 2x4 into the framing of the temporary wall that I had set up. Then I had to move some baseboard I have set aside for another project. I got to figure out what to do with that. But I ripped down a piece of 2x4 to be just about 2 inches thick to allow me to have another little ledge to place a piece of plywood on later. Now, whenever I did try to send some screws in to the stud that was directly above the exhaust vent, I ran into a metal plate, which is good. Don't want to damage anything behind there. So I used some 5-inch decking screws to screw through the original 2x4, through the 2x4 that was on the outside of the drywall, and through the 2x4 that was back in the corner of the framing on the wall. Then I put up a mirroring piece on the left side and a piece on the front too to mirror that back part that is up against the wall. A good rule of thumb to keep is you want to be sure that you send at least 2 or 3 screws into each 2x4. And whenever you do that, just make sure that you're screwing both into the wall and into the framing for the storage shelves themselves. It will give it a lot of structural support, and you'll see here shortly it can hold a lot of weight. I did want to emphasize the more you do this project and as you go through it, the easier it is because it is so modular. Once you just figure out how to install the first wall, the second wall is easier, the third wall is easier, everything is simple. But very importantly, I did want to stress the importance of customization. Now, you're going to have weird shaped things. Like for us, we have this super large chest. It's 100 years old. We love it. We don't have room for it in our house, but we need it to go somewhere. So this entire system allows you to measure that object that you need to put there, like grandma's antique chest, and figure out the exact spacing you need to set up a shelf or a set of rails to slide that thing in or to set up an individual shelf. Or even for me, I have this small portable grill. We love to use it. We just don't have a great spot for it on our back patio right now. So again, the world's your oyster. You can set it up exactly how you want to. From there, before I finished it all off, I did cut an extra piece of plywood and installed that directly over the fridge. And then I was surprised that it actually held my own body weight. I'm a little over 200 pounds and whew, man, I was super glad that this thing was strong. Now, last but not least, I did have a little bit of extra wasted space directly over my refrigerator, so I used some pieces of plywood as spacers to secure these L-shaped 2x4s that I had pre-screwed together. After I had mounted them with clips in place or clamps in place, I then just screwed everything together with 2.5-inch screws, cut another piece of plywood, and set it directly on top of there before screwing everything together. Now, let's review what everything looked like before we got started. Not terrible, but not great. Now, the transformed product looks amazing. I really love the finished product, okay? Regardless of if you use a very fancy or expensive box like the one that I have. Frankly, you can use this for whatever you want, whether it's accessing the boxes, removing them, putting them back. It's very accessible. And the thing that I love is that everything has its place and it's completely adjustable depending on what I have a need for. So like I had mentioned, I have this little speaker system that I wanted to have directly over my refrigerator. It works perfect for this. Or if I need access to my fridge, I don't have to worry about the boxes getting in the way. Even if I need to get my dog's food, I can just bend down, unscrew the cap, and get everything that she needs. On top of that, again, it just looks very aesthetically pleasing. And things that I need to be hard to access, I can make them hard to access, like paint thinner or spray paint. Or things that are a little bit more valuable that I want to get up out of the way that could be a danger to little kids, like potentially an air compressor or a big can of paint. I can be able to keep them out of it. Even being able to create a little space right here where I can charge batteries or access individual tools is extremely valuable. So if you liked what you saw today, please like, subscribe, give me a thumbs up, and I look forward to seeing you on the next one.